Hello everyone. So obviously this is not the usual background, but I had this thought while walking around here and I thought I would actually share it before it vanishes away. So usually when tackling big questions or existential questions, we think through an affirmative way, let's say, or from a positive way. So if we want to ask the question of the meaning of life or a definition of word, we would ask what is the meaning of life, or what do you think is the meaning of life, or what is the definition of this word. But I actually think sometimes tackling those questions through thinking through negation or thinking what they should not be is actually a better starting point. So if we take the example of the meaning of life, I think sometimes asking the first question of what do you think life should not be would actually give more enlightening insights towards the question of the meaning of life in and of itself. Because if you were to ask what is the meaning of life, it sounds like a very big question. But if you start with the conjecture of what do you think, or if you start with the question of what do you think life should not be, then it becomes easier to tackle that question and actually try to get more concrete answers to the question. And I think when thinking through a positive or an affirmative way, a lot of people kind of dismiss the depth of the question. So for example, if you were to ask most people what do you think is the meaning of life, a lot of them would say life is whatever meaning you make out of it. But at the same time, if you ask them what if a person wants to count the grains of sand as a meaning of life, for instance, would you think that should be the meaning of life? They would probably say no. So from that perspective, it seems like that doesn't coalesce well with their first answer. So as soon as we asked what do you think or what should not be the meaning of life, interesting exceptions emerged, let's say. And then you can go on further to investigate where those limits should be and all these different things. Now, we see in this example that thinking through negation or thinking about what the thing should not be or the limits of the thing actually gave rise to more interesting questions, which eventually would actually lead us closer to the truth, let's say. So from that perspective, it seems like the meaning of life, which is a big existential question, is actually a good example of this. If you truly reflect and think about it deeply, everything is defined by its limits. Because if things didn't have limits, then everything would just be one and wouldn't make sense of anything. So from that perspective, it's good to establish the idea of thinking through negation or thinking through the limits of things, because as we said, everything is defined by its limits. Sometimes we know where those limits are, sometimes we don't know. For example, we don't know where the limits are to creativity, for instance. But we know that there is a limit to creativity because putting some random letters next to each other is not considered creativity. But other things are considered creativity. So from that perspective, there is some kind of limit, but we don't know where the limit is. As opposed to other things like physical things, for example, we know where their limits are. So from that perspective, this idea of thinking through the limits is a pretty deep one. Another good example would be the definitions of words. So if you were to ask what is the definition of God, a lot of people would just struggle with this, let's say, word. But I think if you start with the question of what is not God, then this becomes a little bit more enlightening, let's say. So this is the insight I actually wanted to share. I had this thought while walking around here and I thought I would actually share it. So I hope you found this video beneficial and see you next time.